The other probably most noteworthy case, I think, during the 2018-2019 period is a case where the taxpayer won, and it's in the machinery industry, which, as we mentioned, is a large area of objections. So machinery and software make up 50% to 2/3 of the objections in any given year. This was an interesting case that dealt with a neat cross spectrum of developers, and I think it's typical of the industry here. So what we'll talk about is the two different cases that were discussed in this, or two different projects rather that were discussed in this case, and the different activities by year. So in the very first case, they were trying to develop a horizontal lathe that could meet very high tolerance requirements. It was a 13-meter workpiece that weighed 80 to 100 tons, and they wanted to surface it for General Electric to very high tolerance of under 1,000th of an inch across the entire span of the equipment. So again, very specialized work. In the first year, what they did is they had a hypothesis that they could achieve these goals by buying some existing lathes from Europe. They tried and adapted these, tried to adapt these and failed, and ended up reselling them. This activity was called a project, but I would call it an activity within the sphere, was deemed ineligible by the courts, not so much on the issues cited or discussed, but more on the fact that the client didn't provide any evidence to support the claim on that activity. In the 2007 year, they hypothesized design of a specific lathe, the 80-ton lathe, to handle the requirements in the project. And in the 2008 taxation year, they extrapolated the design concepts of the 80-ton lathe to scaled down models of 60 and 40 tons. Ultimately, the work on the 80-ton lathe was deemed eligible, but the work on the subsequent work on the 60 and 40-ton lathes was again deemed ineligible. So we'll discuss specifics in a minute. The key variables or areas of uncertainty that they identified here were really methods to control inertia and deflection, which can then have multiple variables in there. That's what the case didn't really outline. And then the use of a welded versus a cast iron structure, which was supposedly new to that size of equipment in the industry, so a departure from standard practice. So very quickly, going into the background of the claimants, that the case was heard in 2019. It represented roughly $1.2 million of federal credits across two projects that spanned 3 taxation years. One of the main developers and owner of the company, Mr. Debedrosian, is a machinist and tool maker, so he had very little formal education, but had run the shop since 1974 when he developed the company or started the company up into the current day, where it employs about 30 people full time. One of the main witnesses and one of the main developers was a subcontractor, Mr. Perdue, who is a professional engineer with 47 years experience and had worked in aerospace and other large companies in the development of machine tools. So the objectives of this case was to first adapt, as we said, lathes of another manufacturer, but ultimately to develop a large lathe capable of meeting G's ever-increasing exact tolerances, which was really kind of a world-leading thing at this time. So one of the things that we're told here is we didn't really see a lot of information on what the claimant had done to define prior art. And in fact, I'll do a little example of how it could have done a quick prior art search, but much of the judge's decision was based on the testimony of expert witnesses. So the claimant had 2 expert witnesses, Dr. Stevens and Dr. Ng, and then the CRA in turn had its own expert witness, Dr. Altinis. Okay. Now, as I said, they didn't really talk about a prior art search or background being done there. Sorry, something's jumping around on my screen there. Okay, seems to have stabilized. So what happened was there was very little prior art search done, but there was reliance on expert witnesses, both by the CRA and by the client. In the first activity, we're told that the client had tried to adapt these different lathes and that ultimately that didn't work and they were resold. What ideally we would like to see is, as in the Mac and Mac case that Jay explained, some kind of prior art search example. So some of the keywords that they could have looked at are lathe, length of workpiece, precision of finish, methods to control inertia and deflection, and as such, pull up some kind of definitions of prior art. So an example that we have here is when I run these terms in Google Patents or Google Prior Art Search, I get a listing, a scholarly listing of different methods to control chatter and vibration, and kind of the cutting edge of research on that. So looking at those sightings, it provides a list of other documents that would deal with chatter, high-speed milling, some of the methods that might have been used, which we could in turn cite as to why they would or wouldn't apply to our situation, and again, give more support to what is state in the art. As I was reviewing these prior art examples, I noticed that there was actually several articles written by the CRA's expert witness, Dr. Altinis. So again, if that were the case, you could refer to the expert witness's own articles on issues that may support your case. Ironically, in this case, that was the case, that the CRA's own expert witness acknowledged or admitted in the testimony that when you put all the machine parts together, all the different components, there was a system uncertainty that the vibrations or things that could cause an intolerance across such a large workpiece, when you're talking micron or thousandths of an inch type scale accuracy, would multiply, and in effect the CRA's expert witness almost became an expert witness in this case for the claimant. Okay? But to illustrate how, again, Dr. Altinis' publications, in a 24 publication, he'll talk about recent developments in simulating, machining, and grinding processes in virtual environments and different effects on cutter part geometry and how those could be modeled and whatever. So again, you've got an example here of what would be state of the art. And it doesn't take long. It takes literally minutes, maybe hours to do a quick search like this. And it could give you ideas or a basis that could in turn make the entire project eligible or ineligible. Okay, so coming back to the case of the horizontal lathe here, we're told that the 80-ton lathe was the basis of the eligibility, that there was issues on the positioning of drive systems where the various components between the spindle, the chucks, the tailstock mechanism that were used to hold the pieces into place, all of which had issues on the design and changes in which a minute increase in vibration could cause the whole position or whole system to go out of tolerance. So there was some unique things, such as longitudinal glides, which were said to be unique within the system itself. Use of bedways, and other things that were, again, not typical of the designs in the industry, according to the work of the expert witnesses. Now, ideally, you wouldn't need the expert witnesses. You could support that with your own due diligence work as to what was typical in the industry in this case. Okay? So based on the facts that the client had identified system uncertainties throughout the different components and subsystems that multiplied together to create vibration or deflections that could result in those micro tolerances not being met, the judge felt that work was eligible. Again, work on scaling those technologies down to smaller devices was not deemed to be eligible in the subsequent year. Okay, the second project was a double wheel roll grinding machine. We're told that the uncertainties here were methods to move the wheel, methods to prevent the spindle from overheating, and again, methods to control the vibration, which that in itself could break into numerous subsections or variables, which would form the heart of the project. We're told in this case that the client basically wanted to have a grinding head capable of being moved to either side of the middle of a workpiece for grinding. Typically, this was not possible, and repositioning such a large workpiece would take 16 to 18 hours and realignment process because, again, you're doing precision grinding on very large equipment here. So effectively, he wanted to have a method where the grinding head could position itself so you didn't have to reposition the workpiece. As far as defining prior art, again, there was no prior art search done here as far as I can tell. However, we were told that the client had got a quote from Toshiba in Japan, who is assumed to be an expert, and who had quoted them $6 million to produce this machine and would not guarantee it would meet the required tolerances. So what would be interesting is some of that report might provide some of the issues or concerns that Toshiba had as an expert in this industry as to why it may not be able to meet those tolerances. And those in turn, I'd say, would be valuable evidence here, again, to define prior art and again, help us isolate what are the issues of uncertainty and or variables we're going to use to address those. Okay? So basically, the judge commented in here that there was no knowledge within Canada internationally based on the evidence provided of seeing this done. So he didn't feel, as a result, that the work was routine engineering. Okay. Some of the novel aspects were work that they did on the spindle to help it not overheat using specific types of bearings, along with different types of grease. Choosing to fabricate rather than cast the wheel bed was seen as somewhat unique or not used typically in industry. And again, things that they used in the prior project, the guideways on the 80-ton Mateo that they developed, the linear guideways, which were seen as advancement there, were again used here, so that knowledge was applied from one project to another as another step or activity within the project. Okay. Ultimately, based on the evidence, the judge was satisfied that the testimony of the chief engineer, along with his experience and the issues cited, provided enough evidence that it was not routine engineering and that the work would be eligible. Okay, so again, I'm finding, as Jay said, that these examples, although not perfect, are actually good starting points to look at what happened based on a real-world scenario and to fill in the blanks and to learn from it. How could we use this as an example of a precedent that's set for an industry? And unlike a government published example, which could be removed or changed at any time, these tax court precedents are permanent and we should always be able to refer to them. So I think by analyzing them and figuring out what went wrong and what went right, the next generation of tax court claimants will basically hopefully be more successful by not repeating the mistakes here within their claim process. Okay, the last